Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jacqueline Dorsey of Lean Frontiers and I'll serve as your host today. I'm excited to bring to you today a short webinar on the Lean leadership facilitated by Joe Murli. So for now, I will go ahead and turn things over to Joe.
Okay, thank you, Jacqueline. Good morning, everybody. I'm Joe Murli. And today we're going to talk about the lean management system, the elements and how they work together to create a system of enhancing the creativity of the workforce. A little bit of an introduction. So my lean lineage goes back to Pratt Whitney. You may have read Lean Thinking in Chapter 8, which Jim Womack titled The Acid Case, where we effected a cultural transformation in a, in a pretty large, complex organization and made a whole lot of mistakes along the way, but more importantly, there's a whole lot of learning that's taken place since 1988 on forward. And what we're about to talk about is the research and the learning that we've built upon since then. So what you're seeing in the lower left-hand corner here is actually a photograph of my first lean event. This is now the late 1980s, and this is a work area in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, and we're making something called inlet guide vanes at the time. Not necessary that you know what they are. If you don't, that's fine. But suffice it to say that at the beginning of this event, those parts that we're making were traveling about 2.5 miles in the production process, and it would take us about 2 months, a full 2 months, to make parts that really only had about 7 hours worth of labor in them. So that obviously represented a tremendous amount of waste. So in engaging in a Kaizen activity, at the end of 5 days, we picked up every piece of equipment and relocated it so that parts only traveled the distance that you see in that U-shaped cell. And instead of taking 2 months to make one, we demonstrated we could make one in a day. And instead of taking 10 people to keep up with customer demand, we're able to do it with 4 people, freeing up the remaining 6 to effect further improvements elsewhere. And on Friday afternoon, we had a closeout event. And I have to tell you that in these early days and these early Kaizens, it was a thrilling experience to see what we could get done in 5 concentrated days of work. Prior to this, as an engineer at Pratt, it would take me up to 6 months to pick up one piece of equipment and move it across the plant. And to see that we could affect this kind of change in such a short period of time was almost like injecting oxygen into the plant. It just caused us to think entirely differently about what could be done and what the possibilities were. So we looked back at this and said, oh my God, we're able to make this kind of change happen in a week. So what we need to do now is put a plan together and do one of these things called a Kaizen event every other week someplace else in Pratt Whitney around the world and start to just rapidly go through the organization. And the plan we put together said in about a 2.5 year period, we covered all the major areas of Pratt Whitney. And we've been an organization and nobody else in doing these Kaizen event improvement that could be realized in 5 days. Well, some of you may have experienced the same thing, but what I have to tell you is I back to Rocky Hill about 3 months later and took a look at what we had pulled together, and it was a very disappointing sight. What I'd seen was that things were degenerate. Some of these workbenches you see were pushed out of the way. That nice clear floor space in the middle was filled with inventory, and the operators were actually standing around the outside of the benches instead of the inside. And instead of 4, there was a variable number anywhere between 6 and 10 sort of gathered around, and big batches of guide vanes were being pushed along. So generally, if I'm in a public workshop, I'll start the class by sharing this experience and asking how many people in the room have had a similar experience. And virtually almost always all the hands go up. That this idea of sustainability is elusive, and it's a bit disappointing. Well, one of the things I came to realize was that it wasn't just the technical change that makes lean lean. It's not just the technical process improvements that affects this business performance improvement, but really what it's about is unlocking the collaborative problem-solving capability of the people. What we had not realized at the time is that there's an entire management system wrapped around technical change that our senseis at the time really spent no time discussing, no time describing to us whatsoever. In fact, I was convinced that they didn't even see it as something that had to be taught. The response when we talked about sustainability was, well, you need to do more Kaizen. If you keep doing Kaizen, you'll develop Kaizen mind, and people will get excited. But I have to tell you that we really viewed this as an engineering exercise, and that the reduction in travel time, the improvement in quality and productivity were all things that we're looking for, and we viewed this the way any manufacturing engineer would view it, in terms of we're making improvements in cost, quality, and delivery, and that's our focus. What we had neglected was that prior to doing this, these people that were in that work area were separated by 2.5 miles of distance and 2 months of inventory. If there was a problem in making those veins, it would be very difficult for them to even know that there was a problem. What they did know was that a fork truck came and brought material into their department. They did their jobs as best they could, and then a fork truck came and took it away and put it in a warehouse, only to be moved to the next process when they were ready for it. But by co-locating them into this area, we've created the potential, not the absolute, but the potential for a learning laboratory. Because for the first time, these people standing shoulder to shoulder could see raw material turned into finished product. And if we knew how to manage it, and we chose to do so, we could create capabilities, competencies in that workforce that would cause them to come together and think every day about how to improve that process. But the fact of the matter is, in those early days, we really didn't understand what we had to do in terms of the management system to get them in the proper mindset and give them the proper capabilities in terms of time and competencies and skills in order to identify those problems and solve those problems. And in fact, for us, the word problem was a problem. We wouldn't even use the word. We'd call them opportunities. Problems were viewed as a negative thing, and never did anybody come to a production meeting all excited over the fact that they've discovered 4 or 5 problems in their work area and voice it that way and say, yeah, I found 4 problems and we're working on them right now, and I'm really excited about that. If anything, we came to these meetings with the illusion that we had no problems. And ultimately, we came to learn that no problem really is the problem. Or the perception that there's no problem really is the problem. So we started thinking about this lean process, and I have to tell you that in my early days, I'd be part of a team of experts that would take a look at a process, and maybe it was underperforming in terms of quality, or maybe it was underperforming in terms of cost, or maybe it was underperforming in terms of delivery. And I am what I like to term a recovering Six Sigma black belt. And as part of that, we would come together and improve the process from wherever it was to some anticipated goal. And then we'd go on to the next project. And as we just got through talking about, what we actually discovered was that over time, that process would decay. Invariably, it would decay. Almost 99% of the time, it would decay without some attention to keeping that from happening. And also, because this is an expert-based system that I'm drawing out for you here, there's a very limited number of problems that we can work on. So the act of determining which problems to work on became a major activity in and of itself. So Dr. Pareto was alive and well in all of this. Well, in a lean system, what we're trying to do is improve the process from X to Y, as you see, and get it up to that red line. But very importantly, and this is the distinguishing factor, is once we turn that work cell over to those that were making the veins, what we want them to do is each and every day come together and think about, how did we do yesterday? Where was the waste? What ideas do we have to do it better today? Let's pick one of those and try it, and tomorrow let's make that our new standard work. All right, so this is what separates lean from everything else. That top curve versus that bottom curve is what separates a collaborative, team-based problem-solving approach, which is the hallmark of a lean thinking organization, versus a group of experts identifying the worst problems and doing cost-benefit analysis and then focusing on fixing those problems before deciding what the next problems they're going to solve. So this is the Holy Grail. This is what separates Lean from all the other process improvement activities. Yes, we talk about the artifacts of cells and one-piece flow and standard worksheets and standard work combination sheets and takt time and all of those things, but ultimately what we're looking for is to create that flow, not only because of the cost and service benefit improvements, but because it creates the environment to unlock the human potential of the workforce. It creates the environment in which people can see the problems that they couldn't see before, and if we manage them properly, are able to do something with those problems. And that's what the Lean management system is all about. So before I get into this model, I have to tell you that I owe a debt of gratitude to David Mann, who was the first person to really write extensively about the management system required for a lean thinking organization. Creating a lean culture is an outstanding piece of work, and David at the time had to solve a problem. He was at Steelcase, and he was experiencing the same things that I was experiencing at Pratt Whitney. In fact, we were using a lot of the same consultants for that matter. And he was getting as discouraged as I was when I hear him speak. It's almost as though I feel like myself speaking up there. He talks about the fact that we do these improvements and then watch them decay. And we do these improvements and we watch them decay. So his first order of business was to sustain the game. And if we think about that, there's really three major elements required for sustainability. One is there has to be an agreed to standardized work. And when we think about standardized work, we think about the current one best way in which we agree on how to do something. All right? So this is our standard we adhere to. But I'm going to add something to that definition. It'll become more apparent why in a moment. Is that not only is it the current one best way we've agreed on how to do something, but when we get to continuous improvement, we have to say, and we will change it 10 times in the next 10 months, and everything that brings in with it. So we have to put in the infrastructure to come up with ideas and actually reflect that new standard work in a very aggressive, very effective way. The second piece is visual management. And why do we need that for sustainability? Because I always need to be comparing what is happening to what should be happening. Even if the people doing the work have been well trained and have years and years of experience, and they'll say that they know how to do the job, and they actually do know how to get the job done. But human beings drift over time. And then if there's multiple human beings involved, you're going to have multiple ways to do things, and sustainability is going to start to decay over time. So we need some visual tools that tell us this is how the work should be done. So typically we're looking at what's the work to be done in this area. Is there a process? Is it being adhered to? And is product and information flowing as we expect it? Now also, we want to measure results visually as well. So that's the fifth question we're looking to answer, is now that I know there's a process and it's being adhered to and product and information is flowing as expected, are we getting the performance results that we're looking for in the focus areas of people, quality, delivery, cost, and rate of continuous improvement? So when we think about visual management, there's two buckets of tools there. One bucket is what we call visual process adherence, which tells us if there's a process and whether or not we're adhering to it. And the second bucket is visual process performance, which says once I've confirmed there's a process and it's being adhered to, I want to know how well we're performing. And notice that sequence, which is the way I think about it from a management perspective. I don't ever want to start with the performance and then work back up to the process. I really want to start by confirming the process and then looking at performance. Otherwise, what ends up happening is the process tends to drift, performance doesn't necessarily show the results of that drift, and we're not necessarily satisfying the customer in the manner in which we're looking for. And then we get around, again, for sustainability, leader standard work. And you might notice I crossed out behaviors here, because at this point, all we're looking at are the requirements for sustainability. So what do leaders need to do to sustain? They need to walk the workplace and confirm that there is a process, confirm that it is being adhered to, and identify situations in which it's divergent. Now, for sustainability, I don't necessarily need to develop problem solving in the workforce. It's a desirable thing to most people, But the reality is, if all I want is sustainability, what I have to do is just manage the heck out of them, make sure they're adhering to the process, and when I see a drift, maybe call an expert in and fix the drift. So this goes back to the days of Frederick Taylor. So Frederick Taylor would go down to the floor in the steel mill and design a methodology to load up the furnaces and put some numbers together and say, okay, we should be able to shovel this many tons of coal in a day. We should be able to coke the furnaces in this amount of time. So we should produce X amount of tons of steel on a daily basis, and then point to the supervisors and say, it is your responsibility to make sure that they adhere to this process which I have designed. In fact, Frederick Taylor stood up before Congress while they're doing an investigation on the Industrial Revolution and how to sustain the gains there, and said, first let us understand that the basis of scientific management is that the worker will work at the slowest rate that goes unpunished. Not exactly a lean thinker, certainly a process-driven thinker, certainly focused on sustaining those processes, but he clearly believed that he was the expert and that management was in place to make sure that those processes were adhered to. So we look at these elements: standardized work, visual management, leader-standard work. These are the fundamental requirements for sustainability. But remember, we said that the thing that distinguishes lean is everybody every day coming together and thinking about how do we do, where's the waste, how do we do it better today than we did yesterday, and this collaborative, team-based problem-solving approach. So to truly unlock the human potential of the workforce, we need more. Right? We need the remaining pieces. At the top, at the 12 o'clock position, is this concept of true north. People need to understand the purpose of the organization. Now, while there can be metrics that will tell us whether or not we're staying on the path to that value-driven purpose, the metrics themselves are not the overall purpose of the organization. So what is the problem that you're solving? What is the problem that you're solving for your customer? What is the problem that you're solving for the people within the organization? What is the problem that you're solving for society around you? Those things come together in a way that makes sense for your organization, that define the true north. So why is that important? It's not just hanging something on the wall in the waiting room that maybe salesmen are reading while they're waiting for somebody to talk to them. This is something that will get brought onto the shop floor, brought onto the factory floor, so that as discussions are happening about how we're going to make this next improvement, we can filter it against that true north and help select the problem, or rather the solution that we're going to focus on today, because out of these four things that were just proposed, this is the one that brings us closest to true north. So it's brought to life each and every day at each and every one of these meetings in dozens, if not hundreds and thousands of locations throughout the organization. Standardized work we talked about, the current one best way, we've agreed on how to do something, but that will change 10 times in the next 10 months. Visual management we talked about, visual process adherence and visual process performance, answering the big 5 questions. What's the work that should be done here? Is there a process? Is it being adhered to? Product and information flowing as expected. And then and only then am I getting the results I'm looking for in people, quality, delivery, cost, and rate of continuous improvement. So now we're adding a new one in, people systems. We take a look at all the policies, processes, procedures, and past practices that affect behaviors in the organization. And largely, these processes are under the responsibility of human resources in most organizations. Not all of them and not in every organization. It doesn't really matter if they are or they're not. The point is we have to lay all these processes out, put them up on the wall, so everything we do from the time we hire somebody all the way through their career until they separate from the company, there's processes that are pulled in along the way. We have to examine them and determine piece by piece which of these processes are supporting the collaborative team-based problem solving that we're looking for in a lean thinking organization and culture, and which of these are actually working against them. So if we're looking for collaborative team-based problem solving, we have to be careful that we're not rewarding the Lone Ranger, the single contributor, and demonstrating to the organization that while we may be saying one thing, we're actually rewarding something very different than that. That's just one example of the many opportunities, many possibilities in which we're either rewarding the proper behaviors and encouraging the proper behaviors and not the wrong ones. Other times it's just simple nuts and bolts like organizational design. You say you want to do Gemba walks, you say you want to have an and-on system to respond to abnormalities, and you want to conduct daily reflection meetings, but then you look at the organization chart and you find that somebody has 54 direct reports. Well, they can't possibly be responding to all the and-on activations. They can't possibly be conducting reflection meetings without some adjustments to that. So again, we're looking at all of those things to make sure it's consistent with the processes and behaviors in the lean thinking culture. Then we get to leader standard work and behaviors, right? We're adding in the behaviors at this stage, which go beyond sustainability and drive continuous improvement. What I have to tell you is, in my experience, the biggest change for me was moving from being the problem solver, the person that stepped in, synthesized the information, and proposed a solution, to being the coach that built the problem-solving muscle of the subordinates that reported up to me. That was a major transition because, frankly, the behavior that I was trying to change was the exact behavior that led to my success as a manager within the organization to begin with. And now suddenly I have to put them the question and change it. And really to learn the art of humble and appreciative inquiry, to learn to ask open-ended questions without presupposing the answer, and lay out on the table everything we know about a possible problem and determine whether or not we know enough, and then ask the question, how can we learn the things that we don't know? And then and only then, after answering all those, determining what the possible countermeasures are, and using that as a coaching and learning opportunity for my people. That perhaps was the toughest part of the transition for me, and I found it to consistently be the toughest part of the transition for those that aspire to be lean thinking leaders going forward. And finally, there's accountability systems. Accountability is an interesting word because we tend to use it interchangeably with the word blame. If we look them both up in the dictionary, we'll find that A, they're spelled differently, B, they mean very different things, and the reality is they have very different results. So blaming environments are environments in which problems are hidden, they're compressed. Accountable environments are environments in which problems are surfaced and they're dealt with forthrightly. So what we have to think about is that if we're working in an environment where a negative outcome is associated with a negative consequence to a specific individual, well, that's a blaming environment. And, you know, that individual is probably going to do what they can to not surface problems because they perceive that there's going to be some negative consequence to them. They're going to be reprimanded, or there might be the raise won't come this year, or maybe the promotion gets overlooked, or worse yet, they end up getting fired, or something of that nature. Versus accountability systems in which when something doesn't happen as it should, we collectively gather up and look at the process that was involved, look at all of the touch points, and determine where the process went awry and who's involved in each of those touch points and how we're going to keep that problem from happening again in the future. So we're not saying that there would never be a situation in which an individual is held responsible for a negative outcome. Deming said that 95% of the problems are in the process and not the people. He did not say 100%. So even he would say that there is a small percentage of times in which the individual is truly at fault. The problem comes in is that typically we act as though the opposite were true, that 95% of the time we can just deal with the individual and make the problem go away, and maybe 5% of the time we actually get to the process. And what we need to do is flip that around and be a process-driven type of organization. So the key here is that each of these things will lead to some benefit. Each of these individually will lead to some benefit. So the traditional Kaizen activity of creating flow and standardized work, we know that leads to benefit. Putting some visuality around it, that leads to benefit. Well, it's only when we start working these things together and truly unlocking the synergies, and not just even looking at them sequentially, but unlocking the synergies of how they work with one another so that we understand that leader standard work, doing the Gemba walk, is 10 times more effective if I'm walking into a work area where there is standardized work and I can compare what should be happening versus what is happening. There is visual process adherence, visual process performance. So we can both ask the question, so what do you see, instead of me importing a report into the work area, and matching that up with the incentives and the people systems matching that up with an accountable environment versus a blaming environment, staying focused on our purpose as an organization, then suddenly that Gemba walk takes on a whole new level of horsepower and impact in the organization. And it's the synergy that's critical here that goes well beyond doing the Kaizen event and creating that U-shaped cell that I showed you at the beginning of this session. So sequentially, we find that while you can do these things as the pulls exist, we find that they tend to build upon one another. Right? Starting with value stream mapping, getting things to flow, putting the standard work in place, the visual management laid on top of that, building the competencies of the organization, largely problem-solving competencies appropriate to every level of the organization, and then laying on top of that leader standard work and behaviors. While there's hard lines drawn between these boxes, there's lots of overlap. We find these things build upon one another, and we repeat this through the organization throughout the transformation process. So what really is critical is attitude. We find that what we personally believe will largely drive what people around us believe. And there's a picture there of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison talking about God knows what. I mean, when you have invented the automobile, basically, and invented electricity, basically, and I know they didn't actually invent either of those things, you can just imagine what these titans might be talking about with one another. Not only did they develop a few core technologies, but they built entire industries around it. And attitude is all about it, right? It's if you think you can or you think you can't, the chances are you're right. And I know when we're in these leadership roles of driving lean through the organization, sometimes it feels like we're handcuffed. Sometimes it feels like we can't get done what people are asking us to do. But it starts with a belief that you can, and then starts with going on to, well, how am I going to go about doing that? And finally, I'll leave you with the thought that we're easy to find at the Murli Group. There's a website there. And if you'd like to read more deeply about it, there is a book out there called The Lean Management System, and you can scan that QR code and find out more about how to get your hands on the book or to contact us for more information. So, Jacqueline, with that, I will turn it back over to you.
All right. Joe, thank you for facilitating our session today. As mentioned previously, today's webinar is being recorded. Look for an email following our time together for a link to the recording. Feel free to share this throughout your organization. So again, thank you, Joe, and thanks to each of you for participating in today's session. Goodbye.